Islamic history. God sides with Aisha. When we last left Medina, the community was being rocked by a scandal and by uncertainty. Now, among history's famous incidents, anything famous, and therefore ripe for conspiracy theories and alternate takes, there's never going to be ever a really, really, truly final word on the subject. Things like, how did the dinosaurs disappear? Or who killed Alexander the Great? Or what killed Alexander the Great? Who actually discovered America first? Who was responsible for the German surrender in World War I? Who killed Kennedy? And so on. Many people opine on these things, but especially when politics and ideologies and religions get involved, these questions are never truly settled. And it doesn't matter how much seemingly objective evidence that there may be. We do live here in a modern world, where there's still plenty of people who think that the world is flat. And so even science, as useful a tool as it may be, is just not enough on its own. But that's our world, and most communities, really. However, this was no ordinary community. This was Medina in the year 627. So there actually was a way to prove that something was undoubtedly, positively true. Now, that would not be the scientific method. It wouldn't be some form of forensic evidence or even witnesses or the word of an increasingly unquestioned leader, which they did have. This community, at least in its own conception, had something even better, because this community could hear from God himself, the creator of the universe. And if Muhammad said that God said something, that was the end. Full stop. No arguing, no appeals. To dispute the Quran would be to dispute God. And to dispute Muhammad, you couldn't do that either. Because to do that, you'd have to renounce Islam. And you couldn't do that, even if you wanted to, at this point. So this was about as final a verdict as can be given. And just when the Muslims needed it the most, it was a pattern by now. It would continue to be a pattern. And so just when they needed it the most, God set the community of Medina straight and gave them 100% indisputable proof. This is from the Quran, Surah 24, verses 11 to 20. Indeed, those who came up with outrageous slander are a group of you. Do not think this is bad for you. Rather, it is good for you. They will be punished, each according to their share of the sin. As for their mastermind, he will suffer a tremendous punishment. If only the believing men and women had thought well of one another. When you heard this rumor and said, this is clearly an outrageous slander. Why did they not produce 4 witnesses? Now, since they have failed to produce witnesses, they are truly liars in the sight of Allah. Had it not been for Allah's grace and mercy upon you in this world and the hereafter, you would have certainly been touched with a tremendous punishment for what you plunged into. When you passed it from one tongue to the other, and said with your mouths what you had no knowledge of, taking it lightly while it is extremely serious in the sight of Allah. If only you had said upon hearing it, how can we speak about such a thing? Glory be to you, O Lord. This is a heinous slander. Allah forbids you from ever doing something like this again, if you are true believers. And Allah makes his commandments clear to you, for Allah is all-knowing, all-wise. Indeed, those who love to see indecency spread among the believers will suffer a painful punishment in this life and the hereafter. Allah knows and you do not know. You would have suffered had it not been for Allah's grace and mercy upon you, and had Allah not been ever gracious, most merciful. So here we have God's verdict. This whole thing was wrong. It was a slander, a vicious lie, and the perpetrators of that lie will be punished. A little more on that later. Now, this addresses the specific incident, but as you might have noticed, this also goes way beyond that, because the later 2/3 of this passage is basically a sermon on the evils of gossip, specifically false gossip, and that no one should do it again, using this high-profile example to demonstrate the chaos that false rumors often create. You also see a hint of a Christian principle in here as well. Now, this is something that you see most prominently in monastic communities, but it really should apply to everyone. Think the best of your fellow Christians, your brothers and sisters. Always assume their best intentions. This should be the baseline unless it has been proven otherwise. And also, we're being told in the Quran here, this actually should have been very, very obvious to everyone from the start. Now, why? Because it didn't meet the standard. And what is the standard? Well, we are told you must have 4 witnesses for this kind of accusation. And that is a very, very high bar, because we're talking about adultery here. I mean, how often is there even 1 witness, let alone 4? So we're given a clear legal standard here. And as a refresher, how many witnesses were there to Aisha and the young man doing what they were accused of? Well, that would be exactly 0. No one saw it. And yet, here we have a community upended for a month over something no one even saw happen. This wasn't even hearsay. It was entirely innuendo and rumor. And there was no one even pretending to be a witness in any of this. So, the Quran is telling us here, this whole thing should have been dismissed as nonsense from the beginning. And now God has spoken, meaning the 4 people I mentioned in the previous episode, well, they are now in a whole heap of trouble, especially the ringleader. I mean, look at what God just said. As for their mastermind, he will suffer a tremendous punishment. Now, that means there will be a harsh, horrible punishment in store for Ibn Ubay, right? I mean, surely God's words will override his power as a Khazraj tribal chief, right? Well, no. On Earth, at least. He would be the only one of the 4 who wasn't punished. Just like he wasn't punished for withdrawing his troops at the Battle of Uhud, or any of his other misdeeds. Why? It still blows me away, and I think historians as well. Why does this guy, who clearly wants to get rid of Muhammad and be the leader of Medina, always escape punishment for crossing Muhammad? This is one of the more interesting intrigues of Medina, and there really is no clear answer. I've never seen an accounting for this. There is some data point that is just lost to history that explains this, but no one has ever found it. So, I mean, we could guess, but that would be kind of pointless. But what I'm trying to convey here is there is no real answer for why exactly he has this kind of leniency. And especially here. I mean, God himself is saying these people will be punished. But for Ibn Ubay, who Aisha herself blamed more than anyone else for this whole thing, Punishment would have to wait for the hereafter. And this whole business with Ibn Ubay points to a rather unpleasant reality, a dose of raw ugliness that reminds us of what happens in any society. Even in a society of true believers, where all should be equal under the law and subject to God, even then, some are more equal than others. So, I do think, personally, it's very important that you realize in human societies, there will be no utopia. It's not possible. Even in a society that has God Himself on call to render judgments and give advice, we're still here on earth with people. So, this society at times behaved like any other society. If something happens, if a powerful person does something stupid, it will always be the less powerful who bear the brunt of the punishment. And this isn't just an ancient thing. This isn't a historical relic, misbehavior of the unenlightened ancients. This is something that is permanently hardwired into any human society. It's just as true then as it is now. And if you live to be middle-aged, it may happen younger as well, but eventually you will start to see this pattern. For the younger, you're not there yet. The older, you know what I'm talking about. This pattern, it doesn't change. I have seen this in my lifetime, from globalization to the war on terror, to the financial meltdown, to the rise of the NGOs, to the year-long festival of farce and stupidity that was 2020. Freedom, avarice, and profit go to the top. Accountability goes to the bottom. And it was the same thing here. Ibn Ubay was not punished, but the lesser participants were. All three of the people who played a role in spreading this rumor got 80 lashes. Okay, that's not eyelashes, that's lashes. Hitting somebody with a whip, okay? So 3 of the 4 got 80 lashes. That would be the 3 of the 4 who were more at the bottom. And again, this may sound familiar to our time, right? The powerful man got words, the rest of the people got the whip. And, like today, this lower status was often accompanied with humiliation rituals. Like Hassan, writing poetry about the incident, he would say, "By Allah, he has exonerated the mother of the believers and belied the people in what they said. Safwan is innocent of the slander, as Miriam was cleared of false speech." Now, maybe I'm wrong to mock that. Perhaps I'm being a little too cynical here. Maybe he was sincere. But then again, some people who engage in the obligatory humiliation rituals, this is something we saw often in 2020, they really did seem to believe that they deserved it. And maybe Hassan did. It's hard to say for sure, especially from this far away in history. But in a way, it's kind of fitting. Because this whole thing with Ibn Ubay avoiding punishment and otherwise probably good-meaning people being whipped for their involvement, it's a wonderfully farcical end to such a farcical episode in history. And not just farcical in that it was quite probably entirely made up and without merit, but also because of the farcical circumstances that made it possible. And personally, I think this happened exactly the way Aisha said that it happened. She was basically a child. And this whole idea of looking for a necklace at the worst possible time, is most definitely something a girl her age would do. It's more believable than what sounds like an idiotic plot to commit adultery. I mean, but then again, if a 13-year-old were going to have an affair, would you expect nothing less? I suppose that's a fair enough thing to point out in the other direction. But then again, can a 13-year-old even think in that way? Was she even mature enough to have an affair, let alone plan one? And this brings us to the farcical element of this that you're not supposed to talk about. The place your mind has probably gone, but you're not supposed to think about it, especially if you're not a Muslim. It just seems rude to let your mind wander to this subject, let alone say it in public. But I would say history is history and truth is truth. If it's there, you should talk about it, right? Aisha is 13 years old, maybe possibly 14 at this time. And she's married in the full and conjugal sense and has been since she was 9 years old. So we have that. And then we have her husband, Muhammad. And the guy she's married to is now 57 years old. Now, do you know any 13-year-old girls with posters of 57-year-old men in their bedrooms? And what does an ancient man of 57 look like? I mean, would that be closer to our 77? And Aisha is also just one of around half a dozen wives at this point, and that number is climbing. And her husband also has, basically, to can the euphemisms, concubines and sex slaves as well, what he would call women of his right hand. And despite all this, somehow, Aisha is in massive trouble for maybe, possibly, occupying the same space as a young man for a few hours. And this whole awkward situation brings forth the forbidden question. Let's say she actually did do it. If that was the case, was Aisha maybe entitled to a young man given the circumstances? This rumor succeeded for a reason, and it probably wasn't because it was true. It's because it was believable. And someone in Muhammad's position would be naturally insecure about his barely pubescent bride being around someone much younger and stronger and more attractive. And he must have known, even in the back of his mind, that she's not completely oblivious to his sexual indulgences. And if he had tons of sexual partners, was she not entitled to just one more, if only for a few hours? Now, I'm not saying this in terms of systematic morality. Obviously the answer is no. But I'm talking about the mind beyond that. Again, the mind that is going to be listening to rumors like this, and that's probably going to pop into your head. And this and all these other things just compound the farcical nature of this entire episode, which is, admittedly, what makes it so dang interesting. This thing is presented as a big deal, as a massive accusation. I mean, which it was, of course, legally speaking, and in that society. But from our vantage point, in our time, this just looks ridiculous from the start. We're told this was tearing up Muhammad inside. And maybe it was. I mean, it probably was. But really? The cynical brain, the modern 21st century brain, just kind of kicks in and says, am I really supposed to feel bad for Muhammad here? Or even take this seriously? Like, you understand the underlying situation, right? I mean, in our society, This is someone approaching retirement who is married to someone approaching puberty. And it's not like the two fell in love and decided to get married. Aisha was promised at 6 and married at 9. She had zero say in any of this. And now, just because she was left behind on a trip, she is being accused of doing something her aging husband is already doing with God knows how many women. And somehow, she's the criminal. I really can't imagine her headspace during all of this. I mean, no wonder she got sick afterwards. Now, some cynics would say she spent a month in her father's house to procure an abortion, but I think it's far more likely she just couldn't handle the stress. And on top of that, maybe subconsciously, the astounding hypocrisy at the heart of all of this. Now, Aisha was so young, and she was being dragged into adulthood and forced to bear the full brunt of the real adult world from a very, very early age. And remember, she was arranged to be married before she could even understand what marriage was. She probably had sex way before she knew what sex was. And she was thrust into the world of female intrigue and sexual politics before she could possibly be ready for any of that. This is something that would be inevitable when you're one of several wives and concubines. And now she was facing not just these accusations, but that horrible moment when you come to understand and eventually accept the world as it really is. To see people who lie without shame, and the way people will mercilessly advance their own interests, and the very harsh truth that this is not a just world that we live in. This is not a loving world, and it never will be. And not simply because humans are going to be human. There's that. But you also realize that most people aren't even interested in any of that, particularly those who advance to positions of power. They're interested in themselves, in their thing, to improve their station at any cost, no matter how trivial or pointless or even completely insane that perceived gain may be. Now, I remember personally when I made this realization. I was part of what turned out to be a brief nationwide scandal. And like Aisha, my only crime was being a bit naive and probably careless. But man, when you see the knives come out, it's just stunning. I mean, for me, it started with a crazy person lying for no reason. And then me as a reporter, I was basically the middleman in a story I didn't realize was a lie and completely made up. And then the wild accusations, they just fly around. And suddenly I'm being connected to powerful conspiracies and people I've never heard of. And I see these stories swirling around me, and not a single one of them is true. Now keep that in mind when you read your daily news update. The truth was, I was just a dopey 20-something that was having fun writing, and who grew up in a world where people did not lie like that, which gave me a poor radar for this level of sociopathy, which I didn't even realize was possible. And yet, that story, the true version of that story, it never surfaced. You'll never find it. It doesn't exist. It never, ever came out. Even though the truth was far simpler than anyone realized. And this is when I understood that truth is totally immaterial in a situation like this, and to the people's motivations to tell the stories, and to mass media, later social media, and to anyone in a position of power. And naturally, my opinion of humanity in general, was demoted permanently. And I think eventually most of us get there at some point. Although there are some who are able to live oddly blessed lives where they are never exposed to this kind of thing, or maybe are able to suppress it in some way. But I think for most people, this happens at some point. It could be 20, it could be 80. And for Aisha, this was that point, and at a very young age. Here she was, like every other introduction she had to adulthood, she was being thrown into the water and told to swim. And this is where you see just how bad people can be, and how people who know you can turn on you in an instant to protect themselves. And this moment, as necessary an experience as it may be, it can cause a breakdown because it's traumatic. It certainly caused a breakdown for me, which is why, in my opinion, it's totally believable that Aisha was sick for a month and had to stay with her father. I did something similar in that moment. And I was in my early 20s when this happened. She was 13 or 14. Now, this is adulthood grabbing you by the throat and saying, hey, you're coming whether you like it or not. And unfortunately, for Aisha, this would basically be a running theme for her entire life. Now, this wasn't the first time this kind of thing happened to her, and it wouldn't be the last, but it would be the final lesson in her initiation into adulthood. And I'm sure that was further reinforced when later on, nothing happened to Ibn Ubay. This would not be Aisha's final brush with palace intrigue, but it would be her last as a child. Regardless of how she may have appeared physically, after this incident, she would be an adult. And I believe it was formative for her and extremely helpful down the line, because in much, much later history, keep in mind how young she is, and she would live a full life, Aisha would be a prominent figure in politics and even in some military affairs long after Muhammad's death, which would continue her rather unusual, if maybe harsh, path through life. Thank you, and I'll talk to you next time. Inshallah.